In the year 238, the Roman Empire placed its fate in the hands of a 13-year-old boy. His name was Marcus Antonius Gordianus. History would call him Gordian III, and he wore the purple robes of absolute authority over 60 million people across 3 continents. He commanded the world's most powerful military. His face appeared on coins from Britain to Syria. His edicts carried the weight of law, and his word could order executions or elevate senators. He was, in theory, the earthly representative of Jupiter, the living embodiment of Rome's eternal majesty. In practice, he was a frightened child surrounded by murderers. Gordian III never ruled. He reigned for 6 years, but the empire was governed by others. Senators who saw him as their tool, generals who saw him as their ticket to power, bureaucrats who signed his name to documents he probably never read. He was elevated to the throne not because anyone believed in his capacity to lead, but because Rome's political system had suffered a complete nervous breakdown. Every adult with legitimate authority had failed, had been murdered, or had revealed themselves as monsters. In desperation, the Senate turned to innocence itself, to a boy too young to have accumulated enemies, too inexperienced to have formed dangerous ambitions. It was a fantasy that could not last. Gordian's story is not merely the tragedy of one ineffectual emperor among many. It is a window into the psychological collapse of Roman imperial authority in the 3rd century, a period when the very concept of legitimate rule disintegrated under the pressure of military mutinies, foreign invasions, economic crisis, and the realization that no institution, not the Senate, not the army, not the Praetorian Guard, could produce stable leadership. The empire clung to symbols because it had lost faith in substance. It elevated a child because it could no longer trust adults. This is the story of how a teenage emperor became the stage for Rome's hidden civil war, how the most powerful men in the empire fought silently for control while maintaining the fiction of unity, and how a boy emperor marched into the desert and never returned, murdered, perhaps, by the man who would claim his throne. It is a story of manipulation, betrayal, and the terrible vulnerability of power when separated from the capacity to wield it. It is the story of an emperor who never ruled, because Rome itself no longer knew what rule meant.
The crisis began with blood, as so many Roman political crises did. In March 235, Emperor Severus Alexander was murdered by his own soldiers near Moguntiacum on the German frontier. He was 26 years old. His mother, Julia Mamaea, who had effectively ruled the empire through her son, was killed alongside him. The reasons for the assassination were complex. Military dissatisfaction with Alexander's perceived weakness, resentment of his mother's dominance, and the army's frustration with what they saw as insufficient pay and respect. But the deeper cause was structural. The Severan dynasty, which had ruled for 4 decades, had exhausted its legitimacy. When Alexander died, there was no obvious successor, no clear line of authority, no mechanism for orderly transition. The soldiers on the Rhine elevated their own choice. Gaius Julius Verus Maximinus, a Thracian peasant who had risen through the ranks through sheer physical prowess and military competence. History would remember him as Maximinus Thrax, Maximinus the Thracian, and he was everything the traditional Roman elite despised. He was enormous, reportedly over 8 feet tall, a man of legendary strength and appetite, crude, uneducated, and with no respect for the Senate or civilian administration. He was the army's emperor, elevated by soldiers for soldiers, and he had no interest in the political niceties that had constrained his predecessors. The Senate was horrified. For centuries, even as emperors accumulated autocratic power, they had maintained at least the fiction of senatorial consultation and civilian oversight. Maximinus dispensed with fiction. He never visited Rome. He didn't pretend to respect senatorial dignity. He ruled through military force, launching campaigns against Germanic tribes with brutal efficiency, while extracting crushing taxes from the provinces to fund his wars. He confiscated senatorial property, executed aristocrats on flimsy charges of conspiracy, and made clear through every action that he regarded the Senate as irrelevant. For 3 years the senators endured. They had no army of their own, no means to resist. But in 238, desperation drove them to rebellion.
The trigger came from North Africa. The proconsul in Africa, a senator named Gordian, had ruled the wealthy province for years and was beloved by local elites. When Maximinus's tax collectors arrived, demanding ruinous levies, riots erupted in Carthage. The mob, encouraged by senators who saw opportunity, proclaimed Gordian emperor. He was 80 years old, cultured, wealthy, steeped in senatorial tradition, everything Maximinus was not. Gordian reluctantly accepted the acclamation, perhaps understanding that refusal meant death. He made his son, Gordian II, co-emperor. Together, the two Gordians represented the Senate's desperate attempt to reclaim control of the imperial office from the military. The rebellion lasted 22 days. Capellianus, the governor of neighboring Numidia and a loyal supporter of Maximinus, marched against the Gordians with professional troops. Gordian II led the African levies in battle and was killed. His father, receiving news of his son's death, hanged himself. The Senate's African rebellion ended in utter failure, a blood-soaked demonstration that symbolic legitimacy meant nothing against disciplined legions. But the Senate had committed itself. Having declared Maximinus an enemy of the state, retreat was impossible. The senators knew that when Maximinus returned from his northern campaigns, he would slaughter them. In panic, they elevated 2 of their own as co-emperors, Marcus Clodius Pupianus Maximus and Decimus Caelius Calvinus Balbinus. The choice was telling. These were not dynamic leaders or popular figures. They were competent administrators selected by committee, emperors created by consensus because no single faction trusted any other enough to allow a strong individual to seize power.
The dual emperors represented institutional paralysis disguised as collegiality. Pupianus, the more militarily competent, was to handle the war against Maximinus. Balbinus, cultured and aristocratic, was to govern Rome itself. The arrangement was inherently unstable, born of desperation rather than strategy, and everyone knew it. Remarkably, they survived. Maximinus, marching toward Rome with his army, was delayed at the siege of Aquileia in northern Italy. The city's stubborn resistance frustrated the soldiers, already exhausted from years of campaigning. When food supplies ran low and disease spread through the camps, morale collapsed. In April 238, Maximinus's own soldiers murdered him and his son, sending their heads to Rome as proof of loyalty to the Senate's emperors. The Senate had won. 2 of its own sat on the throne, the military monster was dead, and senatorial authority appeared restored. It should have been a moment of triumph. Instead, it was the prelude to catastrophe. The Praetorian Guard, the elite soldiers stationed in Rome, whose primary function was protecting the emperor, felt insulted. They had not been consulted about the selection of Pupianus and Balbinus. They resented the Senate's presumption. and they understood, with the clarity of men who lived by violence, that weak emperors were opportunities. In July 238, only 3 months after Maximinus's death, Praetorians arrested Pupienus and Balbinus in the imperial palace. The soldiers dragged them through the streets, stripping them, beating them, and finally murdering them in sight of the Roman mob. The Senate's carefully constructed dual emperorship ended in humiliation and blood. Rome had gone through 6 emperors in a single year. Each claimant had represented a different faction, a different vision of authority, dynastic succession, military strength, senatorial tradition, administrative competence. All had failed. The crisis revealed that no institution in Rome possessed uncontested legitimacy, that every attempt to create stable rule collapsed into violence, and that the empire's political system was fundamentally broken.
Into this vacuum, the Senate made its most desperate gamble yet. They elevated a child. Marcus Antonius Gordianus, grandson of Gordian I and nephew of Gordian II, was 13 years old. He had no military experience, no political achievements, no personal authority whatsoever. He had been elevated to the rank of Caesar, junior emperor, alongside Pupienus and Balbinus as a symbolic gesture, a way to maintain the Gordian name without giving him real power. But now, with both senior emperors dead and the Praetorians demanding an imperial candidate they could control, the Senate turned to the boy. The logic was perverse, but psychologically revealing. Rome chose innocence because every adult had failed. A child could not be blamed for the chaos. A child had no faction, no history of betrayal, no record of incompetence. A child was a blank slate onto which Rome's traumatized political class could project its fantasies of restoration and stability. Most crucially, a child could be controlled, or so everyone believed. Gordian III became emperor not because anyone thought he could rule, but because Rome had run out of alternatives. The elevation was an admission of systemic failure disguised as continuity. And from the moment he assumed the purple, every powerful man in the empire began maneuvering to become the true ruler behind the boy emperor's throne.
The day Gordian III became emperor, he ceased to be a child. Not in any meaningful sense of gaining maturity or autonomy, but in the only way that mattered to Roman politics. He became a symbol, a stage, a battleground upon which others would fight for power while maintaining the fiction that he ruled. The Senate moved immediately to establish control. They surrounded the boy with tutors, advisors, and guardians drawn from senatorial ranks. These were cultured men, steeped in Roman tradition, who saw in Gordian an opportunity to restore senatorial influence that had been declining since the Augustan settlement 2.5 centuries earlier. They taught him rhetoric, history, and philosophy. They dressed him in imperial regalia and paraded him through Rome in carefully choreographed appearances designed to project stability. They spoke through him, issuing edicts and proclamations that bore his name but reflected their policy preferences. The Senate's vision was clear. Gordian would be emperor the way Augustus had been, a princeps, first citizen, who ruled in consultation with the Senate, who respected traditional prerogatives, who understood that his authority derived from the consent of Rome's aristocratic class. It was a fantasy based on a fundamental misunderstanding of Roman history. Augustus had not been controlled by the Senate. He had masterfully manipulated senatorial forms while accumulating autocratic power. But the senators of 238, desperate to believe they could shape history through the boy emperor, convinced themselves that careful education and moral instruction could produce a ruler who would willingly defer to their wisdom.
The Praetorian Guard had very different ideas. They had elevated Gordian as much as the Senate had, more so, really, since it was their violence that had cleared the throne. They stationed guards throughout the palace, controlling who could see the emperor, when and under what circumstances. They assigned prefects to oversee his security, men whose ostensible function was protection, but whose real purpose was surveillance and intimidation. The Praetorians understood that control of the emperor's physical person meant control of the state. If they determined what information reached him, who influenced him, and what decisions he appeared to make, then they ruled through him.
The dynamic created a bizarre situation, a teenage emperor who was simultaneously the most powerful and most powerless person in the empire. Every morning he woke in the imperial palace surrounded by servants who called him Dominus, Lord, and prostrated themselves before him. Every decision, every meeting, every moment of his day was structured by others. Did he want to visit the Senate? His guardians would decide if that was appropriate. Did he wish to review troops? The Praetorians would determine when and how. Did he have opinions on policy? His advisors would explain to him what his opinions ought to be. We know almost nothing about Gordian's actual personality, thoughts, or desires. The historical sources, written by senators and later historians who focused on political narrative, treat him as a cipher. He is described as virtuous, modest, devoted to his duties, all stock phrases that ancient writers used for emperors they had nothing substantial to say about. But behind this formulaic language lies a human reality we can only imagine, a 13-year-old boy thrust into a role he could not possibly understand, aware at some level that he was trapped, that everyone around him was using him, that one wrong move could result in his death. The psychological isolation must have been crushing. An emperor could trust no one because everyone wanted something from him. His servants were informants. His advisors had agendas. His guards were potential assassins. In Roman imperial palaces, emperors who showed weakness or independence could vanish overnight, replaced by whoever the Praetorians or the army chose next. Gordian had seen this happen to Pupienus and Balbinus. He knew the precedent. So he played his role. He appeared in public when told to appear. He spoke the words written for him. He signed documents he probably couldn't fully understand. He became what they needed him to be, a face on coins, a name in edicts, a symbol of continuity in a system tearing itself apart. The factions surrounding him fought their battles through elaborate theater. When senators wanted to assert authority, they would arrange for Gordian to receive a senatorial delegation, to consult publicly with Rome's traditional advisory body, to issue proclamations emphasizing his respect for senatorial prerogatives. When the Praetorians wanted to demonstrate their power, they would stage military reviews, where Gordian, dressed in armor he could barely lift, would address troops and distribute donatives, cash gifts that bought loyalty but came from a treasury the soldiers controlled.
Behind closed doors, the struggle was more direct. Competing factions attempted to isolate their rivals from imperial access. Guardians were appointed and dismissed based on factional maneuvering. Documents were forged. Instructions were given to the emperor in contradiction with previous instructions, creating confusion about whose orders carried weight. The palace became a battlefield where the weapons were whispers, where battles were won by controlling who saw the emperor last, whose advice seemed most persuasive, whose threats were most credible. Through all of this, the empire itself was collapsing. Tax collection was chaotic. Provincial governors, unsure of whose authority to recognize, hedged their bets or acted autonomously. The frontiers, particularly in the east, where the resurgent Sassanid Persian Empire was preparing for war, cried out for attention that Rome's paralyzed leadership could not provide. Bandits and local warlords filled power vacuums as imperial authority frayed. Yet the coin struck in Gordian's name proclaimed stability. Images showed the boy emperor standing confidently, sometimes with military insignia, sometimes with symbols of peace and prosperity. The legends read, Felicitatis Temporum, the happiness of the times, and Providentia Augusti, the foresight of the emperor. It was propaganda so divorced from reality that it became a kind of collective delusion, a shared pretense that if Rome repeated the formulae of stable rule often enough, stability would somehow materialize. The tragedy of Gordian's early reign was not merely personal, but systemic. The empire had created a situation where no one could govern effectively because everyone was fighting to govern through a proxy who lacked the power to govern at all. The Senate couldn't rule without military force. The Praetorians couldn't rule without administrative competence. The bureaucracy couldn't rule without legitimate authority. So, they fought over a child, each faction convinced that if they could just control him completely, they could control the empire. They were wrong. But it would take a crisis to reveal just how wrong.
While Gordian sat on his throne and played the role scripted for him, Rome was tearing itself apart in a civil war that no one acknowledged existed. This was not a conflict of armies meeting on battlefields or rival generals leading legions against each other. It was a shadow war fought in Senate chambers, palace corridors, and through the administrative machinery of the state. A war where victories were measured not in territory captured, but in influence gained, rivals discredited, and control over the emperor's voice. The Senate attempted to rebuild its authority around what it called the Gordian Restoration. Senior senators portrayed the young emperor as heir to the golden age of the Antonines, as a return to the principle of virtuous rule under senatorial guidance. They passed resolutions in his name strengthening senatorial prerogatives, investigated corruption in provincial administration, and attempted to reassert civilian control over military appointments. These were meaningful reforms on paper, impressive demonstrations of traditional Roman governance. They were also largely ignored. Provincial governors appointed by previous regimes saw no reason to defer to senatorial authority when they commanded local military forces. Army units owed loyalty to their commanders, not to senators in Rome. The senatorial decrees traveled slowly through an empire where communication took weeks and enforcement required military power the Senate did not possess. Senatorial authority extended exactly as far as the Praetorian Guard was willing to enforce it, which meant it extended barely beyond Rome's walls. The Praetorians played a more sophisticated game. They were not interested in direct rule, but in leverage. By controlling access to Gordian, they made themselves indispensable to anyone who needed imperial authorization for anything. Want a provincial command? You need the emperor's signature, which means you need Praetorian approval. Want to prosecute a rival? The emperor must be convinced to sanction it, which means negotiating with the guard. The Praetorians monetized access, accepting bribes, granting favors, building networks of clients throughout the administration who owed their positions to Praetorian intervention.
This system was inherently corrupt and destabilizing, but it was also remarkably profitable for those who controlled it. The Praetorian prefects, the commanders of the guard, became immensely wealthy and powerful, able to make and break careers with a word to the emperor. But their power was also precarious. It depended entirely on Gordian remaining emperor, on the fiction of his authority being maintained, and on no single rival accumulating enough power to challenge the entire structure. Into this toxic environment came the great senatorial families, each maneuvering for position. These were aristocratic dynasties with centuries of tradition, vast wealth, and networks of clients throughout the empire.
They competed to marry daughters to rising military commanders, to place sons in key administrative positions, to build coalitions that could dominate policy. The stakes were existential. Families that backed the wrong faction could face confiscation of their property, exile, or execution under fabricated charges of treason. The political battlefield was almost invisible to contemporaries outside the elite. There were no announced policy debates, no public trials where factions presented competing visions. Instead, there were unexplained deaths. Officials who had been rising stars would suddenly fall from favor and disappear. Military commanders on distant frontiers would receive contradictory orders, then be accused of disobedience when they obeyed the wrong set. Documents would be forged bearing the imperial seal, creating chaos about what the emperor had actually authorized. Rumors became weapons. Whisper campaigns destroyed reputations. Anonymous pamphlets circulated in Rome accusing prominent figures of embezzlement, sexual impropriety, or secret negotiations with foreign enemies. These accusations, whether true or fabricated, could end careers because they created the appearance of scandal, and appearance was everything in a system that depended on maintaining the facade of orderly governance.
Silent purges became routine. Senators who proved too ambitious or too independent would be quietly eliminated. Sometimes they were exiled to remote provinces on invented administrative pretexts. Sometimes they suffered convenient accidents. Sometimes they simply disappeared, their property confiscated by the state, their families scattered. These eliminations were never announced as political killings. That would admit to the Civil War everyone pretended wasn't happening. Instead, they were framed as justice for corruption or necessary administrative changes. The economy deteriorated under this invisible chaos. Tax collection became haphazard as provincial officials spent more energy protecting themselves politically than administering their territories. Trade routes grew dangerous as military forces were pulled away from frontier defense to protect the political positions of commanders. The imperial treasury, already strained by decades of military spending and plague-induced population decline, struggled to fund basic governmental functions. The regime responded with monetary manipulation. The silver content of Roman coinage was reduced to stretch limited reserves, a policy that temporarily alleviated fiscal pressure but caused inflation that hurt everyone dependent on cash wages, which is to say, soldiers, urban workers, and anyone not wealthy enough to own productive land. The coins bearing Gordian's image became progressively more debased, each iteration containing less actual silver, a perfect metaphor for the hollowing out of imperial authority itself. Propaganda intensified to compensate for reality. Inscriptions carved on public buildings proclaimed Gordian's victories over enemies that had not actually been defeated. Coins announced triumphs that had not occurred. Official documents described a prosperous, well-governed empire, even as provincial populations suffered under arbitrary taxation and administrative neglect. The gap between official narrative and lived experience became a chasm. But the narrative continued because acknowledging reality would mean admitting that the entire system was failing. Through all of this, Gordian himself remained almost silent in the historical record. We have no speeches attributed to him, no letters, no policy initiatives that clearly originated from his own judgment. He was present at state functions, visible in processions, named in official documents, but he was absent as an actual political actor. The emperor was everywhere and nowhere, a hologram projected by competing factions who used his name to legitimize their battles with each other.
The hidden civil war could not continue indefinitely. The longer the factions fought while pretending to govern, the more the empire's actual problems accumulated. The Persian threat in the east was growing critical. Frontier defenses were deteriorating. Economic crisis was deepening. At some point, reality would force the competing powers to either unite under effective leadership or watch the empire collapse entirely. That moment came with the arrival of one man, Gaius Furius Sabinius Aquila Timesitheus.
In 240, 2 years into Gordian's nominal reign, the Senate appointed a new Praetorian prefect, Timesitheus. It was a decision that would briefly stabilize the empire, demonstrate what effective leadership could accomplish even in catastrophic circumstances, and ultimately set in motion the tragedy that would end Gordian's life. Timesitheus was not born into the senatorial aristocracy. His family was equestrian, the second tier of Roman elite society, and he had risen through relentless competence in administrative positions. He had governed provinces, managed complex financial operations, and demonstrated a capacity for organization that was rare in any era and almost miraculous in the chaos of the 240s. Unlike the factional leaders surrounding Gordian, who cared primarily about their own power, Timesitheus seems to have actually believed in making the imperial system function. His first move was brilliant and ruthless. He married his daughter to the emperor. Gordian was now perhaps 16, old enough for marriage in Roman custom, and the union served multiple purposes. It gave Timesitheus a direct family connection to imperial power that no rival could easily disrupt. It created a personal bond between the prefect and the emperor that went beyond administrative hierarchy. And it sent a clear message to all competing factions. Timesitheus was not just another player in the game for control of the boy emperor. He had become family. The marriage also transformed Gordian's position psychologically. For the first time since assuming the throne, he had someone in his immediate circle who was neither purely a guardian treating him as a child, nor a manipulator seeing him only as a tool. Timesitheus cultivated genuine loyalty from the young emperor by treating him with a respect others had not shown, by teaching him rather than merely using him. Whether this was sincere mentorship or sophisticated manipulation is ultimately unknowable. Probably it was both, but it worked. Gordian trusted Timesitheus in a way he trusted no one else.
With the emperor's support secured, Timesitheus set about reforming the administration with shocking speed. He purged corrupt officials who had been protected by factional patrons. He reformed tax collection to be more systematic and less arbitrary, improving revenue while reducing the burden on overtaxed provinces. He reorganized military supply chains that had been systematically plundered by commanders enriching themselves. He restored discipline to units that had become little more than armed mobs. He did all of this while navigating the political minefields of competing senatorial factions and Praetorian intrigue, using his position as both imperial father-in-law and Praetorian prefect to accumulate authority that others had frittered away in factional warfare. The results were remarkable. Within a year, imperial finances stabilized, military efficiency improved. The facade of effective governance became, briefly, something approaching reality. Timesitheus demonstrated what Rome's system could still accomplish under competent leadership, even with a teenage figurehead emperor. But external crisis would not wait for internal reform to be completed. On the eastern frontier, the Persian Empire under Shapur I was preparing for war. The Sassanid dynasty, which had overthrown the Parthians 2 decades earlier, was ambitious, militarily sophisticated, and explicitly committed to reconquering all territories that had once belonged to the ancient Persian empires. This meant Roman Mesopotamia, Syria, and potentially all of Rome's eastern provinces. In 242, Shapur invaded. Roman cities fell or were besieged. Provincial populations were massacred or enslaved. Roman prestige, already battered by decades of internal chaos, suffered catastrophic damage. The empire faced a choice: respond with force or accept the loss of the entire eastern frontier. Themesipius gave Rome no choice. He organized a massive military campaign with Gordian, now 18 years old, nominally in command. In reality, Themesipius directed strategy, logistics, and diplomacy. But the young emperor's presence was essential. The army needed to see the emperor, needed to believe they fought for legitimate authority rather than another ambitious general. Gordian, who had spent his entire reign as a puppet, was now required to play emperor in the most dangerous theater possible, a foreign war where defeat meant annihilation.
The campaign began successfully. Roman armies, reorganized and properly supplied under Themesipius's direction, pushed into Mesopotamia. Key cities were recaptured. Persian forces were defeated in several engagements. For a brief, shining moment, it appeared that the empire had recovered its strength, that effective leadership could still produce victory, that Gordian's regime might actually achieve something beyond mere survival. Then, Themesipius died. The sources are frustratingly vague about exactly what happened. Some say he fell ill, some hint at poison, some simply note his sudden death without explanation. What is clear is that in 243, in the middle of a critical military campaign thousands of miles from Rome, the one man holding the regime together simply ceased to exist. The consequences were immediate and catastrophic. Without Themesipius, there was no one to manage the complex logistics of maintaining an army in hostile territory. Supply lines broke down, morale collapsed. The army, already suffering from the brutal conditions of desert warfare, began to fragment. And into the power vacuum stepped a man who had been quietly waiting for exactly this opportunity: Marcus Julius Philippus, known to history as Philip the Arab. Philip was the Praetorian prefect who had served under Themesipius, a position that gave him command of the military forces around the emperor. He was from the province of Arabia, not from the traditional Roman aristocracy, which meant he had no loyalty to senatorial factions and no investment in maintaining the carefully constructed fiction of Gordian's rule. He was ambitious, calculating, and ruthless, everything Themesipius had been, but without the commitment to making the system work. With Themesipius dead, Philip began to maneuver. He cultivated support among officers. He controlled access to supplies. He positioned himself as the indispensable military commander, while the boy emperor, now 19 years old and finally old enough to potentially assert independent authority, found himself once again trapped by circumstances beyond his control. The tragedy was nearly complete. Gordian had been emperor for 6 years, had crossed into adulthood, had led an army into battle, and still did not rule. The one man who had given him any real agency was dead, and the man now controlling the army was not interested in serving as regent to a puppet emperor when he could simply become emperor himself. In the Mesopotamian desert, far from Rome, and surrounded by an increasingly hostile army, Gordian III's fate was sealed. The Roman army stalled in Mesopotamia, suspended between victory and disaster. The initial successes under Themesipius had pushed Persian forces back, but without his organizational genius, the campaign lost momentum. Roman soldiers found themselves deep in hostile territory, their supply lines stretched impossibly thin, disease spreading through the camps, and summer heat turning armor into ovens and daily marches into ordeals of endurance. Philip the Arab, now Praetorian prefect following Themesipius's death, found himself in the perfect position to execute a coup without appearing to execute a coup. He controlled the military forces immediately surrounding the emperor. He managed what remained of the supply system.
He communicated with unit commanders across the army, and most crucially, he could shape the narrative of events reaching both the army and distant Rome. We will never know with certainty what Philip said to his fellow officers, what promises he made, what threats he deployed. But we know the effects. Supply problems that might have been manageable became catastrophic. Orders from the emperor's camp began to be ignored or delayed. The siege operations against Persian strongholds, which had been showing promise, were suddenly abandoned. The army began to retreat, not in an organized withdrawal, but in something approaching chaos. Gordian, if he understood what was happening, was powerless to stop it. At 19, he was finally old enough to command respect from soldiers, old enough that his direct orders should have carried weight. But he had never been allowed to build independent relationships with military commanders. He had no loyalists who owed their positions to him personally. The officers of the army had been appointed by previous regimes, by Timasitheus, or by Philip himself. When forced to choose between an emperor they barely knew and a prefect who controlled their supplies and their advancement, they chose Philip. The ancient sources give us two primary accounts of what happened next, and they contradict each other in ways that reveal how thoroughly Philip controlled the narrative. The first version, promoted by Philip after he became emperor, is almost absurdly convenient. According to this account, Gordian died in an accident during the retreat from Persia. Perhaps his horse fell. Perhaps he drowned crossing a river. Perhaps he fell ill and succumbed to disease. The details are vague in a way that suggests the vagueness is intentional. The essential point is that Philip had nothing to do with it, that the emperor's death was a tragic misfortune, and that Philip reluctantly accepted the soldiers' acclamation as his successor to prevent complete military collapse. The second version, preserved in later histories based on sources hostile to Philip, tells a darker story. In this account, Philip engineered a crisis deliberately. He strangled supply lines until the army faced starvation. He spread rumors that Gordian's continued leadership would doom them all. He allowed or encouraged mutinous sentiment to build among the soldiers. Then, when the army was desperate enough, he either ordered Gordian's assassination outright or created conditions where soldiers would kill the emperor and acclaim Philip as his replacement. Some later sources claim Gordian was murdered at a place called Zytha, near Circesium on the Euphrates River. The Historia Augusta, an unreliable but occasionally valuable compilation written generations later, claims that Gordian died from wounds received in battle with the Persians. Another tradition holds that Philip's soldiers attacked the imperial camp and killed Gordian in the fighting. Yet another suggests Gordian committed suicide when he realized betrayal was imminent and inevitable.
The truth is lost in the desert sand. But the pattern fits too perfectly to be coincidence. Philip was the sole beneficiary of Gordian's death. He commanded the military forces that could have protected the emperor. He controlled the narrative in ways that made his own succession appear legitimate. And critically, he reached an immediate peace agreement with Shapur I, one suspiciously favorable to the Persians, that allowed him to withdraw the army safely and march back to Rome to claim the throne. In those final days or hours, Gordian must have understood that he was going to die. Whether he died fighting, accepting assassination with resignation, or was murdered without warning, he died abandoned by a system that had never wanted him to succeed, only to exist as a symbol it could manipulate. He was 19 years old. Philip became emperor without significant opposition. He negotiated the humiliating peace with Persia, withdrew the army, and returned to Rome, where he presented himself to the Senate as the reluctant successor to a tragic accident. The senators, exhausted by years of instability and lacking the military force to challenge him, accepted his narrative. Philip's coins proclaimed him the restorer of peace, the savior of the army, the legitimate successor. The sources go quiet about the details in a way that speaks volumes. There was no investigation into Gordian's death, no trials of potential conspirators, no punishment of those who might have betrayed the emperor. The silence suggests fear. Fear of what a real investigation might reveal. Fear of challenging the man who now commanded the legions. Fear of acknowledging that Rome's political system had once again produced a usurper through murder. Gordian III, the boy who had never ruled, disappeared into the desert and was quietly forgotten.
Philip the Arab ruled for 5 years before being killed by his own successor, Decius, in yet another military coup. His reign was unremarkable except for one significant achievement. He successfully constructed a narrative in which his accession was legitimate, orderly, and necessary. Gordian became, in Philip's propaganda, a virtuous but weak emperor whose tragic death required a stronger hand to guide the empire through crisis. This framing was so successful that even hostile sources often describe Gordian as ineffectual, rather than as a victim of systematic manipulation and possible murder. The Senate complied with this narrative eagerly. They had little choice. Challenging Philip meant war they couldn't win. But they also needed to believe that Gordian's reign had not been a complete waste. So they memorialized him as pious, dutiful, and respectful of tradition. Inscriptions carved on public buildings praised his virtues in formulaic language that could have applied to any emperor. He was deified, as was customary for emperors who died without being explicitly condemned, but the honors were perfunctory. There were no great monuments, no lasting cult, no genuine veneration. This is how empires erase inconvenient truths. Gordian's reign was rewritten as an unfortunate but ultimately insignificant interlude between the chaos of 238 and the military strength of Philip's rule. The complexity of his situation, the factional warfare, the manipulation, the impossible position of a child emperor in a collapsing system, was flattened into simple narrative. He was young, he was weak, he died, someone stronger replaced him. But Gordian's story reveals something profound about the crisis of the 3rd century that would plague Rome for another 50 years. His reign demonstrated that the empire's political system had lost the capacity to produce legitimate authority that could sustain itself. The Senate couldn't rule without military force. The army couldn't rule without administrative competence and institutional legitimacy. No single institution or faction could govern alone, but they couldn't cooperate because trust had completely collapsed. The psychological insight is crucial. Systems without trust will cling to symbols, even children. Gordian was elevated precisely because he was too young to be a real threat to anyone. He was meant to be a neutral figure, a blank slate. But this created a vacuum that everyone tried to fill, leading to paralysis disguised as governance. The empire needed actual leadership, but was terrified of strong individuals who might accumulate too much power. So it chose weakness and called it virtue.
This pattern would repeat throughout the 3rd century. Emperor after emperor would be elevated, assassinated, and replaced in rapid succession, the crisis of the 3rd century that nearly destroyed the empire. Most were military commanders who ruled briefly before being killed by rivals or their own troops. None could establish lasting legitimacy. The system that had produced Augustus and Trajan and Marcus Aurelius now produced only temporary strongmen and puppet emperors. Gordian III's particular tragedy was that he represented Rome's attempt to escape this pattern through innocence. If they could just find an emperor untainted by ambition, faction, or the compromises of power, perhaps they could restore the golden age everyone remembered. But innocence cannot govern. Authority requires experience, networks of loyalty, the capacity to make hard decisions and enforce them. A child emperor could provide symbolic continuity, but not actual rule. And in the absence of rule, the powerful would simply fight among themselves using his name as justification. The empire's chronic fear of strong men and its equally dangerous desire for innocent rulers created a paralysis that invited disaster. Strong emperors like Maximinus Thrax were terrifying because they might not respect traditional limits on power. But weak emperors like Gordian invited chaos because they could not enforce order. Rome oscillated between these unsatisfactory options without finding synthesis. It would take Diocletian nearly 40 years after Gordian's death to impose a solution: the Tetrarchy, a system of multiple emperors with explicitly divided responsibilities and formalized succession mechanisms. Diocletian understood what Gordian's reign had demonstrated, that the empire could no longer be governed by a single individual claiming autocratic authority while pretending to respect republican traditions. The old system had failed completely. A new system, explicitly acknowledging the empire's complexity and the need for distributed authority, was required. But the cost of learning that lesson was catastrophic. Between Gordian's death and Diocletian's reforms, the empire nearly disintegrated. Provinces seceded. Invasions ravaged frontier regions. Economic collapse impoverished the population. The political chaos Gordian's reign exemplified metastasized into existential crisis. Gordian III stands as a mirror reflecting Rome's deepest pathologies in the 3rd century. He was not murdered because he threatened anyone. He was murdered because even his symbolic value had been exhausted. He was not mourned sincerely, because no one had known him as anything other than a tool. He was not remembered accurately, because truth would have required acknowledging systematic failure that Rome preferred to forget. His story teaches us that legitimacy cannot be separated from capacity. A system can proclaim someone emperor, can surround them with the trappings of authority, can stamp their face on coins and carve their name in marble. But if that person lacks the power to actually rule, whether because of age, inexperience, or structural constraints, then all the symbolism is merely performance. And when the performance no longer serves the interests of those staging it, the performance ends. The Roman Empire survived Gordian's reign, but it was permanently altered by the crisis his elevation represented. The pretense that the Senate could select emperors was abandoned. The pretense that emperors ruled by consent rather than military force was dropped. The pretense that the empire functioned as anything other than a military autocracy became impossible to maintain. Gordian's reign marked the moment when Rome stopped lying to itself about what it had become. He was the emperor who never ruled, because no one in Rome actually wanted a ruler. They wanted control, leverage, a symbol they could manipulate. They got a child, and they destroyed him through their inability to cooperate, to trust, to build anything beyond their own factional advantages. His death in the Mesopotamian desert was not just murder. It was suicide by a civilization that had lost faith in its own institutions and its capacity to produce genuine leadership. When Constantine XI died on the walls of Constantinople in 1453, defending the last remnant of Roman civilization, he died as emperors were supposed to die, with agency, with purpose, making a choice to fight rather than surrender. When Gordian III died in 244, he died as he had lived, powerless, manipulated, a victim of forces he could neither understand nor control. His death was not tragic in the classical sense, where great figures are destroyed by their flaws. It was tragic in the modern sense, a waste, a theft of potential, the sacrifice of innocence to a system that had forgotten how to function. Rome elevated a child to save itself. Instead, it revealed that it could no longer be saved by symbols alone. The emperor who never ruled taught the empire that it needed rulers, real, effective, autonomous individuals capable of wielding power rather than merely embodying it. By the time Rome learned this lesson, Gordian was long dead, his reign a footnote in the catastrophe of the 3rd century, his life a testament to the terrible consequences of choosing innocence over capacity, symbols over substance, and manipulation over trust. He was 13 when they made him emperor. He was 19 when they killed him. And in those 6 years, he never ruled at all.